We Get Outdoors Nation. The other day, I received a Facebook message or an Instagram message or something from a cheeky Aussie who said, "Hey, I know Tim Sharady and I'd like to do something with you." My PA Kat said, "What shall I do with this?" I said, "I've got no idea. Ask the guy on for a chat. Let's have an interview." And so with no further ado, Mr. Ben Cooke, welcome to the We Get Outdoors podcast.
Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm magnificent, mate. How's the world in Oz today?
A bit wet and windy, so hopefully it doesn't give you too much grief on the transmission there.
That's fine. Look, we're all about the outdoors. Wind and water is what we're made of. That's perfect. So
I think that's
we bothered. Our starting point with this is we obviously both know Timmy Sharady. Now, I know him because I Google stalked. Well, actually, I didn't. Kat, who works for me, Google stalked him as a guy who'd sailed on the concrete boat, Sea Gypsy, I think. Where does your story with Timmy start?
Slightly before it. I moved to Sydney after spending a few years overseas in 2016, and Timmy's a Sydney boy. As much as he would tell you he's more just he wouldn't ascribe to any one place. But he knew a bunch of guys that I would then get to know in Sydney, including my future and current partner. And we the first time that we met was actually through a different bloke altogether. I know it sounds a little bit convoluted, but basically rewind sort of 10 years before 2016, I was in Canada at the 420 festival in Vancouver, and with this Australian guy called Tom. And Tom, when I got to Sydney, he said, "Let's catch up." And he said, "My mate Timmy is going to a film festival called the Ocean Film Festival. Do you want to get a ticket and come along?" And said, "Yeah, okay." And went along for a beer into this festival. And in that festival was the 45-minute documentary about the Sea Gypsies ship when they went to Antarctica back in 2014. And seeing the documentary set my mind on a tangent, basically. And first day after I watched it, I emailed Clem, the captain of the ship, and said, "Look, where are you going to be this time next year?" And he said, "We're going to be doing the Northwest Passage." And I said, "What time's the latest I can join?" Because I had a master's that I was doing in Barcelona in 2017-18. And so he said, "June 2018 is the latest you can join." I said, "Perfect, sign me up." And so I turned around back to Timmy and said to him, "Guess who's jumping on that ship that we saw the other night?" And he said, "What? You can do that?" And so he ended up getting onto the ship 8 months before me, and he spent a whole year on board that ship. He started in the Middle Pacific and went up through the Northern Pacific, and then was on board when I jumped on in Alaska, basically. And we spent the next 4 or 5 months going across the Arctic and then the Atlantic.
Wow. So, in a concrete boat?
So that's, yes, in a ferro cement boat that was, it had character, let's put it that way. It had seen a lot of nights.
So
it's actually,
go on.
I would say that the ferro concrete actually is probably, I mean, before I got on the ship, there were bits and pieces peeling off the ship, which they then put in the subsequent documentary that we did for the Northwest Passage. And so everyone was a little bit concerned about the ferro concrete and how it would hold up under the stress of crushing ice. But at the end of the day, long story short, is that I think that the ferro concrete, if we had fiberglass or any other composite, we probably would have been in a lot of trouble on one particular day in mid-September. So the concrete hull was actually a blessing in disguise. It held up like a champion.
Come on, you can't just drop in that one particular day in mid-September and then not tell us why the concrete was the champion.
There's a strait called Bellot Strait in northern Canada. It separates the northernmost part of the North American mainland with the islands above it. And it's about 25 miles across, nautical miles across. So, sort of 35, 40 clicks. And it's about 1 to 1.5 miles wide at its widest point. And we'd had a pretty torturous time getting this far. So as the crow flies east-west, or west-east as we were going, I should say, it's probably just over halfway across, but it was really the choke point, and it was getting late in the season, and we'd had such a time of getting there. We had more ice. We had the most ice in that part of the Arctic, even though the Arctic as a whole that year had something like the third or fourth lowest ice in recorded history. All that barrenness of ice was in the Russian Arctic, not the Canadian Arctic. And the Canadian Arctic saw the most ice that it had in about a generation. And so we'd gotten to Cambridge Bay, which is the primary Canadian Arctic settlement, about a month beforehand, and sort of looking at the ice charts every day going, we've got no hope. Everyone was looking to get off the ship and try and figure out a way to get back to civilization. And Clem, who's a unique individual, to say the least, he just went for it and saw a sliver of, less than 500 meters on the ice charts between land and the ice pack, and they measured it on density, so up to 9+ out of 10. And so we shot through this gap and got to Bellot Strait, and Bellot Strait acts like a big toilet, and so it flushes with the tides, and so the ice will pump into the strait and then flush out. So the idea is that you want to enter the strait as it's flushing out the other way and get pulled by the current. Didn't quite work out that way. We went in. We spent 3 days trying to look for a good time to go in, and eventually we went for it. And we went in, and there was a slight blockage a little way along, maybe 40% of the way along, and we had the decision of the trip really to make, or Clem did, which was we saw a gap to get past that blockage, but you couldn't see. The day was pretty overcast and foggy, and you couldn't see far. You couldn't get the drone up because it was overcast and foggy. But we couldn't see far enough to see if there were any other blockages. And so we went past the first blockage, and lo and behold, there was a monstrous blockage that we couldn't squeeze past further on. So we turned back to get past the first blockage and go back out the other way. But by that stage, that blockage had closed up, and the two blockages coalesced into each other, and we were stuck in the ice. And that lasted for about 3.5, 4 hours of us getting beaten up by, monstrous icebergs moving at 4 or 5 knots. And, like Clem and his whole family were on the ship, and his two oldest kids, who were 18 and 20 at the time, and had grown up on the ship, they were adamant that Infinity was going to go down, Infinity being the ship. So, and then added to that, we had 2 polar bears just pass us by while we're stuck in this mess, and they were completely ambivalent to us. So just another day in the office for them.
The polar bears are like, more people for lunch.
Yeah, exactly. I think they were sort of just like, they weren't particularly interested in us because they thought they would have guessed that, well, we'll just pick them up when they're already dead. no point in fighting for it now. So, but yeah, we ended up getting out. We got spat out the other end, and we had a little party for an hour before everyone's adrenaline sort of subsided and everyone fell apart in a heap, basically. So it was fun. It was a good day. It was one of those days. Yeah.
So when that adrenaline goes, you either want to, often you want to sob or do something, just like go and bury your head in the sand. Like, I can't believe we were there. And
Well, I mean, that was one of the most interesting things of being in a situation like that, and a couple of other situations I've been in over the years where you're really playing with fire, is watching the people around you and how they react to it, watching yourself and how you react to it, and whether you sort of zig left or zag right sort of thing. And so, watching all these the different responses during crisis and post-crisis and pre-crisis. Crisis is, it's probably pretty apt, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, the psychology of it's fascinating for sure.
What do you think leads to those different responses that people are having in those situations?
Oh Christ! It's completely multifactorial. What sort of parenting do they have? Where do they grow up? How scarce were resources? What do they value? I mean, if you look at sort of like the quintessential conservative liberal divide, multiple studies have suggested the conservatives are more risk averse, and so when they get into these situations, their response, whether it's fight or flight, is more extreme because they just don't want to be in the situation anymore. They don't see the value in it. So asking what makes different people's responses differently is sort of the same thing as asking what makes someone politically right wing or scales of right wing as opposed to left wing. There's so many factors to it, and I could probably give you my thoughts on which ones go where in which box, but it's speculation really, and it's case by case basis.
Yeah, was there anybody who obviously you spent some time with the crew at that point in time, and you're observing people and getting to know them?
Yep.
Were there people who surprised you in terms of their reactions to being blocked in and then getting pounded by ice? The cool, calm, collected dude who suddenly is crying in the corner and useless to anybody. Was there that sort of polarizing happening?
By and large, I was extremely proud insofar as I'm anyone to exhibit pride. I mean, I think, let's say that the captain was proud of how the team handled it. At the time, most people just got stuck in and did it. I think there was a pervading sense of, well, look, we're in it now. No use crying over spilt milk. I certainly think that there were people that probably thought that Clem made the wrong decision in going into that environment in the first place. And there was there's probably a bit of a recriminatory sense at some point. But in the moment, all but one or two really lifted their game and got us through. And the one or two that didn't, I probably expected them to be the ones that wouldn't. So pretty much nothing particularly surprised me about the way the team functioned that day, I don't think. I mean, you also have to understand as well that I'd never been on a sailing ship before, bar like when I was 10 years old. And yeah, and I wasn't the only one. There were quite a few neophytes in the group that had no sailing experience. So it was more a collective of life philosophy than any sort of professional ambition. There were a couple of professional sailors, and they certainly made their money that day, insofar as they were making any money, which they weren't. But yeah, no, it was it was a good day. It was a good day in that respect. Yeah, it had been a pretty tough 2 or 3 months leading into that, where there were a couple of flashpoints on the ship because the captain had brought his 2 youngest kids, who were 4 and 5 or 4 and 6 years old, and people were pretty polarized on the ethics of that choice. And there was also the other thing that had happened on that ship was that Clem had decreed, as captains tend to do, that veganism was de rigueur on board, and that no one could eat anything else, anything non-vegan. Now, everyone had their stash, but some people handled that imposition better than others. Let's put it that way.
Jeez, I guess that's
for me.
That's the juggling act of jumping on somebody else's boat, isn't it? Like their boat, their rules.
Exactly. I mean, and for me, it was certainly that because I came on last. I knew what I was getting into. I signed off on it. I said yes to the kids. I said yes to the diet. So, it didn't really bother me. But for some people who'd been on the ship for, like Timmy, a year or more, and they'd had it imposed on them after the fact. And they had it imposed on them in such a way there was no consultation, even if it was Clem's decision. Finally, it felt, from what I understand, because again, I wasn't there when the decision was made. From what I felt, from what I understand, it was very abrupt. And it was also the practicalities of it. So, like Clem was running a foundation for climate change, for, sustainability in general. And so he did this in large part to sort of be hand to glove with that sentiment. He wasn't a vegan before he imposed it, and he wasn't a vegan after the trip either. So say as you will. And so the point being as well that in order to be vegan on a ship where you've got to stock up for a trip like that, the ship was importing all these vegan foodstuffs from all over America at prodigious cost, and the carbon footprint of sending it all to Alaska would have been huge as well, when the alternative would have been throw a fishing line into the harbour and in the port that we had rocked up in Alaska and catch some fish, which were overpopulated. Do you know what I mean? So there's a grey area there, which is an understandable reason for it's perceptions versus realities, right? So it's a difficult.
It strikes me
it's a difficult thing, and
it strikes me in the climate change game that the difference between perception and reality is often quite wide. So, like Greta Thunberg last year or the year before, sailing across the Atlantic both ways to go and wander around America, and yet all of her crew who flew on who were on the boats flew backwards and forwards on planes. So you've got I think there was 14 people flew backwards and forwards across the Atlantic versus 1 for the sake of a message. And I understand all the sentiment behind it, but in terms of practical reality, it's fucking bonkers.
I mean, it's certainly a disparity between. I certainly agree. There's a disparity between perception and reality. It depends on whether the perception informs the reality. So, does Greta Thunberg do more good than the 14 return plane tickets, does she change enough minds that it offsets the carbon that the 14 people are emitting? I can't make that call. It got a lot of publicity, is all I would say. Good, negatives and positives. But would I have made the same choice as she did? I'm not sure. I'd probably not, because at that stage I'd just sailed across the Atlantic one way and I'd had enough.
So we'll stick with climate change, because I've got a few questions for you for a while, because it strikes me that your master's was linked to or around climate change, and then you've just sailed through an area where people often say that part of the world is where climate change is most obvious. Glaciers melting, less icebergs. In fact, you even mentioned a minute ago it was the warmest season the Northwest Passage had seen, or something like that, in living memory, or something like that.
I think it was the third warmest in the Arctic, not in the Northwest Passage, in since recorded history. But in the Canadian Arctic, where we were, it was the coldest in a generation. So, but that goes to. I think that speaks to the complexities of climate modelling and why there's such a disparity between perception and realities, because it's so hard to explain. I mean, we can't even tell you what the weather's going to be in 3 days' time or this afternoon. Do you know what I mean? And so that makes it very difficult for scientists to break through the noise and give probabilities that are, in my opinion, undeniable. The science is as clear as it gets in a subject matter like this for me, and so the rest of it is politics. Really, it's about how much the quintessential thing. Two problems with climate change. With getting climate change taken on board by a majority is to tackle it is dangerous for economies, and economies are the lifeblood of any government, particularly democratically elected ones. And two, it's a long-term problem, which particularly democratic governments are most ill-equipped to deal with, because they have to win elections. So
it's very populist, isn't it? In as much as you've got to be popular to get re-elected. So you do some good work for a few years, you get halfway through your term in office, and then you start focusing on the next re-election, which is 2.5 years away. And then you go, oh, I better go and give people what they want and want to put a quick smile on their face so they'll vote for me again. And often, I wonder whether the last half of the term undoes the first half.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I mean, it's even, it's not just necessarily about, it depends which system, whether it's presidential, parliamentary, or whatever else. But, in America, you need 2/3 of the Senate in order to ratify major legislation. And so when you've got Senate races happening every 6 years, not including runoffs and by-elections, you've got elections every 2 years that can make or break an administration. Like when Obama got in 2009, he had from memory, he had about a year to get the Recovery Act in from the financial crisis, and then got dealt a killer blow because Ted Kennedy died, and his replacement didn't campaign properly and lost to a Republican in a normally Democratic seat, and that threw out the majority, and so they had to compromise. And so there's a whole, trying to get things done when not just yourself but everyone else in a given government is trying to get re-elected is difficult. Anyway, I think that's probably a little bit tangential. Sorry.
No. It's all part of the interesting mix. I mean, one of the things with We Get Outdoors is we firmly believe that if people love something, they generally look after it better. And so one of our philosophies is if we can get more people loving the outdoors, maybe, just maybe, people might look after the outdoors. And the outdoors could be in the middle of a city, couldn't it? It could be just the outdoors is just being out of a house or out of an office.
Sure.
Maybe, just maybe, if more people love it, more people will look after it. There's no proof behind it, but who knows?
Oh, I think there probably is. I mean, I don't know. I would imagine that the more, like anything, if the more the civic body is engaged with something, and whether that something be the community or the environment, the more they tend to take care of it. For me, the issue when it comes to climate change, quite apart from it being tied to economics, which it is that in order to do that, this is going to sound probably apathetic and cynical, but in my mind, realistic. In order to do that, you need to hit critical mass, and I'm not sure whether, for all good intentions, we're ever going to be able to get enough people, not even to make them care. I think that's probably the easier thing to do. But if you've got some woman in the Philippines who's got 5 kids and no father, and she needs to feed them, she's not going to care about the recycling. Do you know what I mean? It's a matter of having enough bandwidth to care for it. And again, that goes back to economy. When economies are strong, like in Australia, in England, where you're from, the way we take care of, on an individual level, not on a governmental level. Australian government's terrible with climate change. But on an individual level, we're pretty conscientious. And I think that's largely because we're well off. We've got privilege, and so we have the capacity in our lives to sort of make importance for things, where in other places it's more of a street fight, a survival instinct. And so while I applaud and back and take part in any measures by which the environment is put into greater focus, my concern is that it not that it won't be enough, but that it can't be, just because of the natures of humanity, existence.
It's
which is depressing, but it's a problem that's here. It's the primary aspect of climate change is that it's upon us, and we're too slow. We're a trial and error species, and we've run out of every move forward progression that we've made scientifically, technologically, politically, has been through trial and error, and I think we're out of time. Basically.
I've got a conspiracy theory. So in my world outside of We Get Outdoors, I'm a high performance coach. I work with CEOs, athletes, all sorts of people. And one of the things that I've been doing it for 26 years now. So I reckon I've got enough anecdotal knowledge and experience to like go and say, this is what I found seems to work. And so my conspiracy theory with climate change is this, that when I want to help somebody achieve a greater performance, if I can get them to have a soul focus, a soul emotional focus, they often achieve greatness. And yet when they're distracted by lots of emotional pulls at the same time, they often well beneath average everything. And I wonder at this point in time, where we've got lots of very justifiable causes that people are championing, and they are amazing: Black Lives Matter, Me Too, the climate, wage gaps, white privilege. I mean, we could just have a little list that we go on, and every single one of them is a justifiable right thing to be working towards resolving and prioritizing. I just think that we may well be spreading ourselves too thin as a population, and being very subpar at everything?
I certainly think that's true. I think that's always been true. I don't know how you change it though. On a global scale, I don't know how you change it. We're a species that has a diverse and great number of interests, and I'm not too sure how you get the only way historically I think that has managed to get people to come together on an issue is when the issue has become a crisis, and where it's become sort of, if not an existential threat, then a localized existential threat, if that makes sense. The amount of unity that was shown during World War II on both sides, but let's talk about the Allies. And then in the post-war period, there was a political unity that was like, we need to rebuild. And to me, it's no surprise now that we're finally sort of reaching the point where World War II and the horrors thereof are outside living memory, and divisiveness is up. And obviously the same was true potentially on a lesser extent after the end of the Cold War and the glow period that America had in the 90s, where democracy was the light, and Fukuyama's end of history and blah blah blah. So I certainly agree with you that there's I would love people to shelve issues like protesting the idea that the Second Amendment's being threatened and go on to something like climate change. I think there's a lot of issues that don't require such fervent attention, and some others that do. But I don't know how we get there. Frankly. I don't know how you tell people what to care about, basically.
Well, if you were to play with this at a values level, you could say that and then if you would say, then you could put problems into a hierarchy to be solved, with the most important value being the number one that you solve, and then other things. And I don't think that you can. I think these values could be pretty global, because the highest possible value you could have is simply existence. That's it. Like eating, sleeping, breathing, that drinking water. Like there really isn't, like, if you're dead, you can't be religious. If you're dead, you can't worry about pay gaps or racism or anything else, because you're dead. Like and if you're Hindu, well, you may come back in another life as a worm or a cricket or a kangaroo. Who knows? Because they've got their 15 lives and reincarnation. But unless you can deal with existence, every other problem to me seems to be pretty slim in its level of importance. So yeah, sure, we could narrow pay gaps in 2021 and go and get it to a complete level playing field, input and output wise, maybe. But if we all burn in 100 years' time because of climate change, we're fucked anyway. What was the point?
Sure, I certainly agree with you. The problem is that people aren't going to burn tomorrow.
That's true.
So it's kicking the can down the hill. So I certainly, yeah, I mean, like, existence certainly is the top of the tree, but everyone's got it at the moment, and no one's, and people are procrastinating about the idea that it's not. It's going to be very interesting in the future, if we're talking about climate change, to see whether future generations will institute laws where or there's talked of now, where laws could be instituted that give criminal penalty to individuals or entities who destroy future generations or the environment of future generations, effectively killing future generations through mismanagement of the environment. I have no idea how to draw that up into a legal document, but
Or police.
I'd welcome it. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it would be more symbolic potentially than have any real bite about it. But I would welcome it all the same, because it would underpin a moral norm, I think. Essentially.
I think that people's perception of how secure their existence isn't as secure as they believe it to be, and I'll tell you the reason why. So I live in Johannesburg, South Africa, so we're about 1,500 meters above sea level on a mountain plateau. That's where Joburg is. 7 hours from the coast, something like that. And
yep.
In the start of COVID, the original lockdowns that happened, they were pretty harsh here. I mean, everybody got told to stay at home unless you produce food or sold food, like in a supermarket. That everybody else, everything stopped. And Johannesburg got within 3 days of running out of all fossil fuels, be it oil, coal, diesel, petrol, the lot.
Wow.
Because they, as part of the stay at home with the lockdown, they took all the refinery workers and put them at home as well. So nobody was refining the fuel.
Was this just Joburg, or was it the country as a whole?
The country as a whole.
Region as a whole.
I mean, the region as a whole. But I live in Joburg. So say again.
The neighbouring countries, Swaziland, Lesotho, Mozambique.
The whole lot.
Yeah, wow. Okay.
So you think that everything's secure, and yet really everything that we need today is produced via a fossil fuel part of the equation, whether we like it or not. You know, there is a truck that delivers the food to the store, so on and so forth. And so 4 weeks of refineries being shut took us to a place where there's 3 days worth of fuel, and it was taking 5 days to go and get the refineries back to functioning. So then there's suddenly a 2-day void. And end
of time apocalypse, sort of everyone in crisis mode.
Yeah. But so I suppose the question is, if people were to be really educated and honest with themselves, how secure really is the world and our little bits of the world that we truly live in? Like, how sustainable is it really?
It's okay. Wow, this is an interesting thought experiment. I think when you laid out the premise, I actually thought that one could argue to the converse as well, that that people feel more secure than they should be. Is what you said, but I could argue quite happily that people feel less secure than they should be as well, in terms of capitalism and the drive to always want more when you've probably already got enough. It's a common argument, but you're certainly true that I think if the world was educated better about where the real stresses are on the economy and on what you take for granted, and where the critical paths lie in terms of supply lines, as you've suggested, there would be a greater push to not be so dependent on them and to diversify security, so to speak. And I think that would be a good thing. In saying that, I think there's a very strong part of human nature which says, I don't want to know. I'm just going to dig my head in the sand. I just want my car filled up with unleaded petrol, please. I don't. Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree. I mean, it reminds you of the subprime mortgage crisis, right, where everything's built on a deck of cards, and if you take out the foundations, it all sort of falls to shit. And the only answer I can have for that is to be more rigorous with how that house of cards is built, and I think that requires more education, not less. So
I think that I'm just wrapping my head around this a little bit. It was interesting. So the other week I interviewed a couple, Keith and I think her name was Jen. Jen, if you're listening to this and I've got your name wrong, I'm sorry. But Keith and Jen Sears, and they're homesteaders in Kentucky. They live about an hour and a half's drive from the nearest town on a gravel road. They're in the middle of nowhere.
Americana.
Yeah, that's it. And they had some very interesting point of views about friends and family from their old world who don't know how to cook a meal for themselves. If you can't Uber Eats it, like it doesn't exist. And how a lot of people they knew were panicking during COVID, and they were like, no change. Like, we have to wear a mask when we go to town. That's sensible. But apart from that, no change. But then they were also then talking to my business partner, Mark, and Mark's got these analogies about 3 different personality types, and he calls it the ostriches, the deers, and the bears. And the ostriches whack their head in the sand and go, it's not me, it's never going to happen, it won't happen in my lifetime, it's not a problem. The deers are willing to accept the fact that the world's a bit wonky, but they're just so dazzled by the headlights, they're actually going to get killed by the car eventually, but they're just stuck. And then you get the bears who are willing to accept reality, willing to take action to go and work towards a reality. But history would suggest that often bears get assassinated or sidelined as being radical extremists.
I like this. It's like a more detailed portrait of the fight or flight instinct thing. I think that's certainly true. I mean, I think, just to go back to what you were saying about people with their Uber Eats and how society doesn't know how to skin a cat or skin a rabbit, let's say. Let's be a bit more PC. I think it's a fundamental thing that sort of post the Age of Enlightenment, just science and technology have gone beyond the pace that one man can understand it back to first principles. And so we've got the malaise that's set in the Western world. There's a lot of talk about depression going up and people feeling a little bit rudderless and blah, blah, blah. I think there's a strong correlation there between not knowing where your food comes from, both theoretically and figuratively and literally. So I don't know how to combat that, because we've always been complex and we're becoming more complex, and particularly in groups. There's no major discovery now that's not collaborative. Whereas there's no more Da Vinci's out there to be had, I don't think. In terms of the ostrich and the deer and the bear, I just concur. Really, I think there's, it's you have crisis, and people are going to get. Unfortunately, the ones that attack it head on are often the ones that have put themselves in harm's way. Obviously, in the case of the bear, and quite often the ones that survive are the ones that just stay the hell out of the way, which is, I don't know, I suppose evolution chose it for some reason,
That's it. It's funny, before we press record, we mentioned the Aussie comedian Tim Minchin, and you were talking about opinions and assholes, and he says you need to go and not look at your arsehole very often, but go and look at your opinions. quite frequently. And I think in that same thing, he also talks about being rigorous with your thoughts and values. Seems to come into play there.
And question all your biases.
Yeah. And I think as humans, we've got a predisposition to seek to increase our level of comfort, or certainly that's the way society and capitalism's guiding us. And I'm not saying I'm against capitalism; it's just probably a reality. And actually, the resolution out of everything that we're talking about actually is discomfort.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think you're probably saying the same thing there from two the different sides of the same looking glass. Everyone looks for comfort based on the socio-political model that we have, and discomfort is what makes us most uncomfortable, which sounds like an tautology, but I think you know what I mean. I don't think that our search for comfort is a given. I think that has largely been imposed by the values that we've chosen to promote. I mean, if you look at the idea of business and capitalism and giving property rights and giving yourself more, or giving your kids more than what you had, has been extremely successful in terms of creating peace or lowering conflict historically. But it's by no means, prior to John Locke, really, or Hobbes, quite a few of the 17th century political thinkers, maybe even Machiavelli. Prior to that, I mean, if you look at the ancient Roman times, they had a thing called dignitas, which was roughly translated to honor and integrity. And that was the guiding light. Being in commerce, being a salesperson, was frowned upon. And that was true, even though clearly capitalism has happened since the dawn of time. It hasn't been wholly and unequivocally supported by the governing class for a long time. I mean, even the British or European aristocracy was in vogue until the onset of the First World War. So, and they were anti-business and just pro-wealth, really. But that was through property rights. So it's sort of a later incarnation of the same thing. But point being is that I don't necessarily think that capitalism and recently neoliberalism as a form of capitalism is the end point for our socioeconomic evolution. I don't know what the next thing is that can maintain the peace as well as capitalism has, and multilateralism has. Multilateralism being under threat now just as much as liberal democracy seems to be. So I don't know what it is, but I'm convinced that it's there, so to speak.
It was interesting. Last year, within COVID, I was listening to an interview with a guy you may well know of, Dr. Jordan Peterson, who wrote a book, 12 Rules for Life. And he's a clinical psychologist. And one of the things he was talking about was being very rigorous with who you are as a human being, what actions you take, and evaluating them against what you believe to be true and progressing yourself. And it was interesting. And I got to the point where I was, and it's interesting you mentioned about being vegan earlier. I got to the point around my meat consumption where if I was truly rigorous, I'd pulled the trigger to kill a cow just by buying the steak off the supermarket shelf and deciding to eat it. And that's got a degree.
Cognitive dissonance there, isn't it?
Say again.
There's a cognitive dissonance between the fact that you're happy to pull the meat off the shelf, but you're probably not. Well, many people are not happy to pull a trigger and kill a cow. So, yeah.
Well, that's where it took me to. So it took me to the place of, and I've also been to an abattoir as well, and factory farming places where they rear literally in factories chickens and cows in where I went to, which. All of those factory farming and those abattoir things are just horrific. And so it took me to a place where I'm like, well, somebody said, do you want to come hunting? And I'm like, well, I don't really know what the answer to the question is, but I guess if I'm ever to work out whether actually I should eat meat or not, maybe I should go give it a go. And, did I pull the trigger and did I kill something? Yes. Do I feel any better or worse about for myself? I don't know. The jury's out. But it's interesting if you start playing that rigorous game with yourself about what do I really believe that as humanity we need to do to go and progress ourselves with doing less damage maybe on the way or whatever it might be. Then what am I really willing to do as a human being? What actions am I really willing to take? It's a very interesting rabbit hole to wander down.
Yeah, quite. I mean, well, I think the answer to how do we progress is to get outdoors, actually. I think that's, I mean, I've always sort of looked at my past self with a sort of tender contempt. Do you know what I mean? I remember being 22, I'm 34 now, and I was 22, I think, when I was traveling through Africa the first time. And I went to Namibia. There's a place called Cheetah Park there, and we got on the source with the homestead's 20-ish year old sons, and then they said, jump in the back of the ute, we'll get the guns, we'll go hunting, and went and found some antelope. And I'm the same as you. I didn't pull the trigger, and I flatly refused to pull the trigger, but it sent me on that spiral. I thoroughly enjoyed it, probably because I was half cut, and 22. But it certainly sent me on a spiral, which has sort of given rise to the same sort of questions that you've just mentioned. Really, and same thing. I did running of the bulls when I was 25, which is for me barbaric now. I wouldn't go anywhere near it. But I think the process of going out there and being exposed to it and then having the conversations with people, in the aftermath of doing it, I was proud of having done it. And then having that sort of reaction from other people saying, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? That's that sort of exposure that you get from having made mistakes. And I would class that as one. And then, trying to dig into it and figure out the ins and outs of why, and gain some insight out of it. So, and now I wouldn't say I'm vegetarian, but I've cut out red meat by the occasional McDonald's cheeseburger.
I'm ethically bound. I can do it all. Just a cheeseburger from McDonald's, please, sir. That's what I want.
Yeah, it's one thing. Having travelled, travelled quite extensively as I have, there's nothing. I don't care what people say about McDonald's and how it's terrible. I know it's terrible, but there's nothing like going through, 3 countries where you cannot find a meal that looks like anything you've ever seen. And then you see the Golden Arches at the next capital city, and you're like, yes, I'll have that. It's if we're talking about comfortability, McDonald's.
So what do you reckon people can... What do you reckon people can learn in the outdoors, or how they can benefit from the outdoors in terms of being more rigorous about their own thoughts, values, and actions? Do you think there's a danger of people just getting in the outdoors and taking their generators and TVs with them and just turning the outdoors into McDonald's? What do you reckon?
Yes, I do. I don't think there's a clear-cut answer one way or the other. It's clearly a grey area for some people with some backgrounds, with some sets of values. They'll want to, glam camp. Is that what they call it? Glam camping?
Glamping.
Glamping. And others will grow from the experience of going outdoors. I mean, I can't imagine someone like Paris Hilton being put out in the middle of nowhere and growing from it, particularly. But I think most people have at least some bandwidth, some ceiling which they can reach, whereby you put them outdoors and you test them, which is what nature does. It removes, if you get outdoors, it removes those comforts and puts you and your wits up against it. And some people like doing that and some people don't. It's the same thing as the ostrich, the deer and the bear. People react in different ways. But I do think, by and large, the more you do it, the better. Insofar as you don't do it too much that it leads to some sort of trauma.
Well, I mean, the outdoors is remarkably equal, isn't it? It doesn't matter whether I'm a billionaire and you're broke. If we're both outside and it's throwing it down with rain and it's freezing cold, we're both getting wet and cold, and there's like, it's just how it is. And maybe the broke person has got more resources to deal with that than the billionaire. I don't know, but it's a very place.
I think you're probably right. I think you sort of hit the nail on the head. While nature is certainly egalitarian, people's conditioning is not. And so, if you've got a guy being sequestered in a multi-million-dollar mansion for his whole life, where he hasn't had to, walk down to the grocery store, then he's going to have 8 atrophied legs, and he won't be able to handle a little bit of inconvenience out in the outdoors for too long, So, yeah.
Cool. So that, before we disappear, COVID's obviously had a dramatic impact on travel in the outdoors over the past, I guess, 12 months for the Western world, and probably a little bit longer for the Eastern world, or certainly for China. I've got several thoughts. How do you think that COVID has benefited us? That's a question we could play tennis with. Because for every one down, there's got to be an up, in my opinion. It would also strike me. Let's play with that one first. So how do you reckon COVID has benefited us?
First of all, I would like to say that I certainly agree with you that while in this case, for one down, there's one up, I'm not too sure I can say the same about every certain thing. I don't think everything's a zero-sum game. But in terms of how COVID's benefited us, I mean, I think it stripped us of our complacency a little bit, I find it a bit more difficult to comment about this in Australia because we've had such a relatively easy time of COVID, depending on where you've been. Melbourne's had it a bit tough, but it's not Europe and it's not South Africa. And I mean, America in this instance is the ostrich, but they've had it much more difficultly than we have. But I do think that it again, like any crisis, COVID's the ability to re-centralize our priorities. So it's taken out of complacency. It's sort of made us value our family and friends who are now largely sort of removed from, I suppose, and economically, we've probably become more conscientious workers as well in the workforce, because the security of our jobs has become more permanent than it was before. So I think the silver linings have to do with not pulling the wool over your eyes as much as we used to, I suppose. I mean, I think a lot of the benefits for COVID will be seen later on down the road rather than right now, because people are still in the thick of it. Running back to climate change, it's actually like they did after the financial crisis. Biden will do what Obama did, which is input a whole bunch of funding for renewable energies and R&D and climate change. And so when the economy crashes like it has now with COVID and as it did 10 years ago with the GFC or 12 years ago, it gives an opportunity to reconstitute an economy and a society in more favourable or more egalitarian terms. So I think that's a really big benefit. It depends whether the governments of the world and the constituencies that they represent are far-sighted enough to actually achieve it, though. Respect.
When I think about all of the things I've experienced in my world or my life, and I think the history books quite clearly document this as well. Often before a disaster, there's a whole series of warning signals that flash up, and often the people who do die in disasters are the people who've missed all the warning signals. And part of me wonders whether in maybe the end of my lifetime, end of our lifetime, whether we'll end up looking back and go, holy shit, COVID was a warning signal and we frigging missed it.
I think it's if you're talking about the prevalence of the ability for pandemics to occur, then if you're suggesting that there might be another pandemic that will do a far more efficient job than COVID's done in killing us, then I think that's something to be certainly wary of. I think with an overpopulated world in this one was through wet markets and bad hygiene practices. It's just compounding problems, and with globalization, America's not far from China anymore. Europe's not far from China anymore. So I certainly agree that this should act as a warning sign, both for pandemics and for general crisis and more generally. Will we rise to the task? Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think putting in the safeguards to make sure a pandemic is better responded to is achievable until it goes outside of living memory. I think if we're using this as a wake-up call for our complacency for the risks that are out there more generally, then I think we're going to have greater trouble, particularly when it comes to things like climate change, which are, as we say, long-term problems that people can find complacency with a lot more easily. It's not quite, because it's long-term, and the effects of more extreme weather events are harder to be tied to a definite anchor point. So, yeah.
I think it's in the Bible, and it's an interesting quote that plays through my mind, and I think it's in Paul or Peter, and my brain is going to go. There's a part of a verse that says that a man is only leaving a legacy when his children's children will benefit from it. And I wonder whether we've lost sight of time in terms of this impact that we have today isn't really for us. And if we view it for us, that's very selfish, arguably greedy. And if we were to play with being a Christian, maybe we should be thinking more about our children's children than just what we're doing today.
Yeah, I mean, my father, who's a conservative, he's Catholic, and was pretty rigorous with his Catholicism until relatively recently. He bemoans the death is too strong a word, but the diminishment of the Judeo-Christian model for society and these values that religion has given us. And it's, I mean, Judeo-Christian model in Western societies is responsible not just for churches, but for most of the institutions in politics. And I certainly agree that that today's society has become very individualistic and egocentric, and I'm certainly a proponent of it. I don't exclude myself from it, and it's dangerous. You know, we were talking before about how the Romans had dignitas as part of that. Was for the generations. They used to have the rich in the Romans had busts of all their ancestors in a room in their house, and people today are too centered on self to have that sort of long-term thinking into the past or the future generations, and I think that is potentially one of the greatest maladies that capitalism is in large part responsible for. And yeah, I don't know how to reverse that until we find another model, basically. But yeah, that short-termism, that individual egocentric point of view is very damaging to the civic body as a whole, I think.
Jeepers. Well, Mr. Ben, I've thoroughly enjoyed our philosophical dive into all things sailing psychology, climate change, politics, COVID, and everything else. And I have to be honest, I could keep on talking to you for hours about this, but we equally could dive down some pretty deep rabbit holes if we weren't careful. And I think we've skirted going like neck and shoulder deep in some of those holes.
Hasn't been the most uplifting chat in many respects, I suppose, has it? But it's been very interesting nonetheless.
Well, I firmly believe that for human beings to progress in the world, that honest conversational tennis with different ideas and principles, we certainly don't feel very equipped in terms of models and thought processes, in terms of how to really deal with the issues that we're facing using a model from the past. It doesn't feel like communism, for instance, is a great answer, just like it doesn't feel that capitalism is a great answer. And the only way we're going to find an answer is playing tennis. And I think that's the importance of having conversations like this.
I completely concur. I think hard truths are all rigorous debate is the one way forward into an uncharted future, which requires solutions of its own. Like, history is great, don't get me wrong, I love it, and it informs greatly, but it's never an exact facsimile.
That's it. Well, Ben, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and hopefully helping other people to go and think in a new way about their world about them.
Well, that's good.
And the outdoors as well. Anything in closing from yourself, sir?
I don't think so. Have a good day. You've got the whole day in front of you over there in South Africa. As you can see, it's getting dark here, and I'm waving off the mozzies.
Cool. All right. Well, let's call it a day, and let's find a good excuse for having another chat soon. Eh?
Sounds good, mate. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.